This is our featured presentation of the week, and hope you all enjoy this. Mark Mills is our speaker, and he's the founding director of the National Center for Energy Analytics, a national energy think tank for scholars devoted to data-driven analyses of policies, plans, and technologies surrounding the supply and use of energy that's essential for human flourishing. Mills is also a faculty fellow at Northwestern University's McCormick School of Engineering and a partner with Montrose Lane Ventures. Mills is also the author of the book, The Cloud Revolution, How the Convergence of New Technologies Will Unleash the Next Economic Boom and a Roaring 2020s, available from Encounter Books. That was 2021, that book. And he's host of the podcast, The Last Optimist. He's also author of Digital Cathedrals, dated 2020. Mills earlier co-authored with Peter Huber, The Bottomless Well, The Twilight of Fuel, The Virtue of Waste, and Why We Will Never Run Out of Energy. His articles have been published widely, including the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, USA Today, and Real Clear. Mills has appeared as a guest on CNN, Fox, NBC, PBS, and The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. So with that, please help us welcome Mark Mills.
Thank you very much, Kirby. And usually it's the Jon Stewart part of my background that is the most interesting to university students and the like, but that was an interesting episode of my life. I'm going to talk about the energy transition while you're eating, so I apologize for disturbing a peaceful lunch. But and I will confess at the outset two things. First, I'm a physicist. I used to do real work. I used to make things, invent things. I have patents from my early career. And I spend my life now analyzing, writing about incredible things other people do. So that's what analysts do. I'm essentially an analyst now. And I work in finance. I'm a partner in a fund and a previous fund. And I also work in policy by virtue of the policy features of my think tank. And I work in politics because we all work in politics. We all care what goes on. And the energy transition is at the intersection of all three, the intersection of money, technology, and politics. All of my analyses are informed by two things. First, that you can't violate the laws of nature. Physics matters. But you can ignore physics. Congress does all the time. They pass all kinds of laws that make no sense. Ultimately, the laws of nature matter. So I do a lot of my analysis based on what's not possible. And also money matters. In fact, what I've learned over my life is that the money part matters the most. It's what animates people. It's what animates politicians. And it's what we have to do to operate anything in the world. So you have heard about, and over this conference, I'm sure, and from my colleague yesterday, Robert Rice, there's lots of stuff about energy transition. I'm going to do what I guess you could call a reality check and start with just a very brief piece of history. For those of you of a certain age, you will have lived during the oil embargo of 1973-74. For those of you who weren't born at that time, it's in the history books. It was an epic event. It was the single largest increase in oil prices in the history of the oil industry. Oil prices went up 300% over 3 months, went up total 400% from the beginning of the embargo to the end of the embargo. Imagine just for a moment the political implications and economic implications if today we learned that the price of oil was starting to climb and climbed 300%. This would be a tectonic event. What happened back in 74, and just to calibrate 74 again, just from a history and technology perspective, the very first cell phones, you remember the giant brick phones? The very first cell phones existed in 1974. It was before cell phones roamed the earth, but we knew cell phones were possible. I worked in that industry then. I was a semiconductor process engineer. We manufactured the chips, went into things like that. And that was a point in history, 50 years after sort of the beginning of the sort of the boom of the oil age. 1920s was when the oil age really started to take off. There'd been oil drilling before that, but that was the big takeoff. And the U.S. in 1924 was producing half of the world's oil. By 1974, 50 years later, it was producing 15% of the world's oil. When the oil embargo happened, it shocked the world, and politicians decided that meant we were running out of oil. It was an embargo. We were running out of goodwill from the Saudis that were shipping us the oil. The world was not running out of oil. But what the politicians did, what Washington did in the face of that massive price increase for oil, is launch legislation in 1974, which has been renewed and expanded on every year in the 50 years since, to find ways to replace oil, to reduce the use of oil, and to avoid the use of oil. They didn't spend any money to look for more oil. They spent all their money on the theory that we were running out of oil, when the embargo was, again, an embargo. There was lots of oil in the world and in the United States. So now what happened is that we spent 50 years of federal programs and many state programs and hundreds of billions of dollars trying to replace oil, reduce oil use. What happened as a consequence of that spending is that between 1974 to our era, 2024, over those 50 years, the world's production and consumption of oil has increased by 15 billion barrels a year. Apparently, we weren't running out of oil, and apparently the hundreds of billions of dollars spent to prevent increase in oil consumption didn't happen. What happened was the era that we now have, we're now being told that we're using too much oil and that we have to stop using it, and we're going to effect an energy transition to avoid using oil, to reduce the consumption of oil by spending money again, because we have to. What I'm going to show you is that, to put it in the simplest possible terms, because words matter. I may be a physicist, but I also write, and I also believe that words matter. There is no energy transition. So I'll tell you the obvious, you might guess. I would tell you, but I'll tell you in advance, there isn't an energy transition. There won't be an energy transition. Well, I'll show you why. But the consequence of attempting to effect an energy transition is very serious, economically, geopolitically, and we're going to attempt to do one. We tried to do one 50 years ago, but this time it's different. The most dangerous words in the English language, as you know, that Warren Buffett has pointed that out many times. So real quickly, you've seen this. I suspect Robert showed you graphs like this. I won't beat it to death except to point out, if you mapped out all the primary sources of energy that the world produces and uses for the last half century, the graph looks like it doesn't. The only thing that matters is two things. All the curves are going up. Consumption and production of everything went up. What went up the most and what dominates the supply of the world's energy are hydrocarbons, oil, gas, and coal. Oil, gas, and coal were about 85% of the world's energy 50 years ago. They're about 82% of the world's energy today. So we've reduced the share of energy provided by oil, gas, and coal, but we have seen a massive increase in the supply. You could call this the iron law of civilization. The future will have more energy, not less. More energy consumed and more energy produced. Or if you map this out in a different terms, because part of this is the idea that we can de-link from oil, that there's some kind of decoupling from hydrocarbons. The way you can look at decoupling is not the amount of oil, coal, or gas used per dollar. That's an irrelevant measure. That's simply a measure of increasing wealth that comes from exogenous factors. That is, wealth comes from cheaper energy and new technologies. That's where wealth comes from. It doesn't come per se from energy. Wealth is created by energy-using technologies. That's what creates wealth in society. And energy-using technologies, if they use less energy, produce more product for less cost. But the per capita use of oil is unchanged. I mean, this is really quite remarkable. If you looked at per person use of oil globally for a half century, unchanged, flat, which is kind of incredible, because if you think about what's going on in the world, this is the two countervailing trends. We get more efficient. Our cars are more energy efficient today, but there are many more cars. Hence, this is what you see at the trend for oil. Same is true for coal, with a big bump for coal when China started producing the first part of the 21st century. And of course, gas consumption, natural gas, has been just trending up nonstop for half a century. So per capita use of gas up, per capita use of coal up, per capita use of oil flat. And since the capita part, the population of the world, keeps rising, even in the face of massive increases in efficiency, with which we use oil, per capita use of oil has stayed flat. I would say if you didn't think of this in energy terms, you thought about this in money terms. If you were an investor, let's pretend, and somebody showed you curves like this on the return on investment of things, and then a countervailing position came along and said, you should stop investing in these because they're all collapsing. These trends are all done, they're over, and you got to put your money somewhere else. You know, the adage that you see with all investment advisors, the past performance doesn't predict future performance. They say that because they don't want to be sued. But the fact is, it does predict the future performance. The only time future is different than the past is if there's a profoundly different phenomena that occurs that changes the world, like wars, pandemics, or the arrival of something that never existed before. So here's where the world is today from the viewpoint of the energy transition. This is really the only fact set you have to have in your head, because we have a constant deluge of clickbait of wind is cheaper, solar is cheaper, solar and wind are expanding at the exponential rate, money's expanding on it, we have to transition. So we've spent about $5 trillion in the last 2 decades on, quote, energy transition technologies to avoid the use of oil, gas, and coal. Roughly $5 trillion. Total money, in both direct and indirect, is closer to $10 trillion. This is where the world is today. It's not, again, 80% of the world's energy is hydrocarbons, oil, gas, and coal. What's important is the 20% that's, quote, renewables. When you hear that, and that statement is often made, people immediately conflate that with wind and solar because that's what everybody talks about. Except when you unbundle it globally, half of the renewables globally are burning wood. Burning wood is the oldest fuel source known to humankind. It's just the oldest. The only thing older is burning dung, which is still done in emerging economies around the world for heating in very poor environments. Solar and wind combined in terms of primary energy are roughly 1/3 globally. All wind and solar combined globally are 1/3 the total energy supply of the world that burning wood provides. This is not an energy transition. This is an expansion. There was no solar and wind in this graph 20 years ago to speak of. Now there is. That's nice. The pie's bigger. Solar and wind have a share of the pie. There's nothing about this that resembles a quote, transition. Even in the United States, I want to point out, because you might have in your head, well, that's for global stuff. A lot of poor people in Africa burning wood. We don't burn as much wood for fuel in America as we did a few years ago, but if you map it out over the last century or two, it's an interesting factoid. America today burns more wood for fuel than it did in 1824. We didn't transition away from wood. Now, as a share of the total energy supply to the United States, it collapsed. That's the blue line. But what a surprise. We produce a lot of oil, gas, coal, and nuclear since then. But we still burn wood. Well, I'll put it again in this simple terms. There are no transitions in energy. There's never been any transitions in energy in the history of humanity, with the exception of 2 fuels. Human beings stopped burning whale oil almost universally, which is a really good thing. And every country where they still burn dung, if they get a little wealthier and they can burn wood and then coal, they do. They transition away from that. And they never do it again. But you keep burning wood for very long times. Transitions in energy don't happen. You have additions to energy supply. But I'm going to come back to this time it's different. What's different this time? Well, I put up here 2 iconic wealthy people. Larry Fink, some of you probably know who he is. He's the president of BlackRock, the world's biggest financial firm. And he publishes an annual letter, and in this year's annual letter, and he's an advocate of the energy transition. But he said some interesting things to hedge his advocacy in this year's letter. And he's very bullish on the energy transition. And he said it's a mega force, a major economic trend. That's true. It's a big trend because we're spending $1 trillion a year on the, quote, energy transition, apparently. And then he says wind and solar are now cheaper in many places. Notice the hedge. This is not a very precise word, many places. It's true, they're cheaper in some places, many of them around the world. And then he points out this has risks and opportunities. For financial people, if you spend hundreds of billions of dollars, if it's government money, that creates both risk and opportunity. It clearly creates opportunities. Another rich guy, Elon Musk, who we hear a lot about increasingly for all kinds of reasons. First, because he's wealthy and successful. He's also very provocative. But he is recently, if you haven't been following this, over the last year has been repeatedly saying, including in a long interview at the annual meeting of the Edison Electric Institute when they had all the utility company CEOs gathered, he accused them of not planning for enough electricity supply. And he's done that repeatedly. And at a world conference in Berlin last month, he said the growth of electric cars and AI, artificial intelligence, are creating tremendous demand for electric equipment and electric power generation. Notice he said equipment and generation. He said that for a reason. He's actually a smart guy. You have to make electricity. There's a technical duh. And you have to deliver it, wires and transformers. And then he said that in a few years, in fact, kind of a little hyperbolic, next year you'll see you won't have enough electricity to run all the chips. It's quite an interesting statement, which I'll show you why he said that in a second. But so first to Larry Fink. He's a finance guy. This is a Bloomberg New Energy Finance graph on your left. The black area is the spending. You probably can't quite see the y-axis. This is in trillions of dollars. The world is spending $1 trillion a year. It's gone from $100 billion to $1 trillion a year on energy transition technologies, wind, solar, and batteries in the main. The hashed area is the level the spending has to go to affect the transition as advocated in the Paris Accord. The Paris Accord doesn't get to a transition with no hydrocarbons. So if you read what the aspirations are for all the countries that signed on to the Paris Accord, that gets you to a future where instead of 80% of the world's energy coming from hydrocarbons, 60% of the world's energy comes from hydrocarbons. Doesn't sound like a transition to me. And to get there, we have to go from $1 trillion a year to $6 trillion a year in spending now. Now. There's no evidence the world is going that fast, but the United States has stepped up with what the Green New Deal advocates who bragged that the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act was in fact the Green New Deal after it was passed. So they're being honest about it. It's almost all the money in that act is for, quote, climate technology, which means wind, solar, and batteries in the main. What that did is a matter of just interest. The graph on your right, this is a bar chart of the billions of dollars being invested in the private markets in climate tech venture capital. These are the people who bet long-term on breakthrough technologies. Notice it's collapsed. When governments start spending lots of money, you get two things happen. They lock in yesterday's technologies by virtue of the amount of money flowing to them, and they frighten off private capital because you can't possibly compete with the bank account of the government, so you exit the market, which is what happened. So the real innovations will end, essentially, for time being. Now, if we go to what Elon Musk was talking about, this is a map of spending by the private markets, not by the government, in tens of billions of dollars a year just on AI, artificial intelligence. And you can see the graph starts near zero only about 8 years ago, 10 years ago, because it was counted in the hundreds of millions of dollars. It didn't reach $1 billion. So the United States is spending $60 billion a year right now on artificial intelligence, more than China. There's a lot going on in the world on this, but to calibrate that $60 billion, that's the spend rate for the whole country on new manufacturing of all kind. So all the manufacturing spend rate, which we've accelerated also with government subsidies, is roughly co-equal to the total spend rate just on artificial intelligence. The reason Elon Musk was pointing out that the AI is in the cloud matter, chips matter, is this fact. This is sort of reducing physics of systems into money terms in the most simple fashion, but maybe the most informative fashion possible. So keep in mind that, unobvious, as soon as I say it, everything that exists requires energy to create and to operate. Not some things, everything. So the Department of Energy is the Department of everything, first of all. So it's a bad department because it tries to, everything requires energy. Not some things, everything. By the way, everything uses hydrocarbons, not some things. The 82% of energy at the primary level supplied by hydrocarbons for all energy is not the share of energy involved in all activities. Everything, every activity, every product, every service somewhere in the supply chain depends on hydrocarbons. Everything, society, not some things. So if you start tinkering with energy, you're tinkering with everything. And the easiest way to figure out when you tinker with energy's availability and cost is just to reduce it to dollar terms. For every $1 billion of cars purchased, $100 million of energy purchases occur a year. That tells you something about, and we measure the global automotive industry approaching $1 trillion of cars purchased. Every $1 billion of aircraft purchased, you will be unsurprised to learn, leads to about $250 million a year of energy purchases to operate the aircraft. It's not surprising. I mean, airplanes are kind of bigger, and gravity's hard to fight, so it uses more energy. Unsurprising. Every $1 billion spent on data centers, for the old type of data centers that we operate primarily now, leads to $300 million of energy purchases annually. And an AI-infused data center, the annual energy purchase rate goes to $800 million a year for every billion. So this trajectory tells you two things. There's going to be more demand for energy in the future, by a lot, because the world is spending trillions of dollars in all three of these categories. It tells you something else that most forecasters utterly fail on. Humans invent demands for energy. After survival, you need energy to survive, but after survival, everything that we invent demands energy. And more importantly, humans are much more fecund, much more imaginative, and inventing ways to use energy than to produce it. We have literally thousands or millions of ways to use energy, very few ways to produce energy. We're very productive at figuring out ways to consume energy. A classic example of that is computing in data centers. The world consumed almost no energy for computing in data centers, obviously, 50 years ago. The first computers were counted in the hundreds and then in the thousands. IBM at its pinnacle had something like 7,000 mainframes before the computer era really took off. The collective electric appetite for those was irrelevant globally. As computers got more energy efficient, got cheaper, they proliferated. We went from essentially no energy to today the global cloud consumes twice as much electricity as the country of Japan for all purposes. Or put in broader energy terms, the global cloud consumes more energy than global aviation. You don't have to be an analyst to think which one do you think is going to grow faster. Well, first, both are going to grow if there's wealth, and the cloud's going to grow faster. A little bit about the cloud because it's kind of interesting. I mean, it's a fascinating area. I worked with a data center engineering company for years on the board. Data centers are kind of like, if you don't know what they are, it's like a Walmart-sized building full of computers. From a physicist, it's just a big heater. It's a 50 megawatt heater. Electricity goes in, heats up silicon. It does useful work along the way, moving bits and storing cat videos and stuff like that. But a data center in square feet is roughly the size of a skyscraper. The difference is as skyscrapers you build up, data center. So about 500,000 to 1 million square feet, typical skyscraper, typical data center. There are about 5,000 data centers in the world that are skyscraper sized. There's 1,500 skyscrapers in the world. It costs about the same to build them. It's kind of interesting, the cost per square foot to build them. But if you're a real estate guy that built it, you could rent a data center for 5 times more per square foot than you can rent space at a skyscraper. But for people like me who study energy, the interesting fact is that the data center consumes 100 times more power per square foot than a skyscraper. So you could just do sort of mental arithmetic here. We're building data centers. Your right graph is data center construction in millions of square feet per year. It's now at 25 million square feet per year of net new data centers. This curve looks like an exponential curve. The order book for data centers now, which is not published, is double. In 2 years, it's just doubled. It's blowing off the map because of AI, because of cost of computing going down. And if you think in terms of the energetic demands and just have that one fact in your head, skyscrapers are electricity consumers. There's 1,500 of them, 10 watts a square foot. There's 5,000 data centers. There'll still be 10,000, same size, and they consume 100 watts a square foot, 1,000 watts a square foot. I mapped this out some years ago in a study I did. I'll have a lot of this information in the book that Kirby mentioned. My book doesn't have energy in the title. There's a lot about energy in the book. Energy is not in the title because, well, I'll make a confession. I knew if I put energy in the title, it would scare the cupcakes off. because because there's nothing about being pro-wind or worried about climate change in the book at all. So I didn't want to tell them there's a lot of energy in the book. There's a lot about energy in the book because energetics define how you can do everything, from make cars work and airplanes, how you move goods, how you dig stuff up, how computers work. It's always about the energetics of the systems. But I mapped out then, and have since mapped out, the three big consumers of electricity globally. Illumination, which is a really big deal. EVs, which were a big deal starting more than a decade ago. And the cloud, which started being a big deal about 15 years ago, technically, and publicly about 10 years ago. So, and these are error bars. But what you can see is when Elon Musk said, we're not going to be making enough electricity because of electric cars and AI, he should have inverted it. As of today, there's about 12 million EVs in the world. The 12 million EVs collectively use less than 1/50th as much electricity as the global cloud. The global cloud, even if the EV growth rate follows the top of this bar, which would take you to a world with 200 million EVs, which could happen. I don't think it'll happen easily. It could happen. That's what the optimists think. Not all cars will be EVs. There's 1.4 billion cars in the world. So getting to 200 million EVs would be a lot, but it's still, you could do the math here. It's like 12% of all cars, which incidentally will remove about 6% of the world's oil demand. Not all the world's oil is threatened by hundreds of millions of EVs. In fact, EVs are functionally irrelevant to the future of the oil industry. Put differently, they probably help the world oil industry because the upstream demand for heavy equipment to make them, which I'll get to in a minute, was going to go off the charts. The diesel demands are going to go crazy. But if you looked at this and you believed this curves, and when I published this, people didn't believe these curves. Now they do. So now you have the tech community saying, oh, we're going to run out of electricity. We need to invest in nuclear power. I love that. I'm a nuclear bull. I spent early part of my career in nuclear energy. I worked for a uranium mining company. I've been the bottom of a 5,000-foot vertical uranium mine shaft. I was at the accident at 3 Mile Island for the week of the accident. I preached the gospel of nuclear energy for 8 years after that, trying to save it. Obviously, I failed because we abandoned it, our industry. I hope it comes back. But if tomorrow the government says, you go, girls, let's build nukes. You don't have to be an expert to know we're not going to have a lot of nuclear power plants to install anywhere for a while. It's going to take years because we have to first spool up the infrastructure. We have to get the very simple things like nuclear qualified welders. It's a very specific classification in apprenticeship to get a nuclear qualification for welding and steel for nuclear vessels. It'll take a while. So with this boom in demand for electricity, they also know they can't do it. The reason they're saying we need nukes for data centers, small nukes for data centers. And they'll build some. This is going to be great. It'll take 5 or 10 years to get the design sorted out. Somebody will be building small nuclear power plants. You can bank on it. But over the next decade, there's not going to be any to buy. They're not going to be installing any. But we're going to be building these data centers like they're Pringles potato chips. It's crazy. Where's the electricity going to come from? They know it's not going to come from windmills and solar plants. They know that. What they also know is where it's going to come primarily from is gas turbines. Natural gas turbines. That's already happening. So it's going to be an interesting intersection of politics and dynamics. So those in the tech community that still think it could be done with windmills and solar plants so we can decarbonize the world, there's only one graph you'd have to have in your head. I borrowed this from Roger Pielke, who's a brilliant professor. He reduced it to a sort of simple idea, just to give you a sense of scale of what people are claiming. If you wanted to move the world from where it is today, the share of all energy provided by non-hydrocarbons, the 20%. So that black line is the share of all energy provided by non-hydrocarbons. Nuclear, hydro, right? Wood, we're going to count carbohydrates as non-hydrocarbons. So you burn wood. Ethanol gets counted even though it's a carbohydrate. We just flip the orders of carbon and hydrogen and pretend it's not a hydrocarbon. It's a hydrocarbon with a flipping around the carbon ratios. But if you take all of them combined, we're about 20%. If you wanted those to be 100% by 2050, a mere not even 30 years from now, if you wanted 100% no hydrocarbons being consumed, you're going to replace all the hydrocarbon stuff, you'd have to build 1,000 3-megawatt wind turbines. The 3-megawatt turbines are the Washington Monument size ones. You have to build 1,000 and install 1,000 of them a day, every day for 30 years. And then you can get to this. you know, once you know that fact, or put it this way, you have to build one 1,000 megawatt nuke every day, build and install, be running. Every day, every 365 of them a year for 30 years, and then you can decarbonize the hydrocarbons. This is nonsensical. It's silly. It's not going to happen. So when I say there's no energy transition of the kind being promoted, it's because the claims on it have nothing to do with physics of energy. We can make nuclear plants. We can make hydro dams. And I've said nothing about the money. Just the sheer magnitude of the construction program involved, society can't do that. We don't have that capacity. This is the same in sort of analogous terms to observing that we've gone to the moon. We put 12 human beings on the moon. We spent about $350 billion to do that, which is in today's dollars, which is pretty cool. And now that we know how to go to the moon, in 30 years, we're going to put everybody on the moon. I mean, you said build more rockets, and everybody get there. There's no construction program possible. Never mind whether you could live on the moon and in the habitat. I'm just talking about getting there. We'll take you there once to bring you home. It is impossible. The only word you can use is impossible. And it's impossible. It's silly impossible. But if we try, we start spending money towards trying to do that. You could spend a lot of money and try to put, let's say, 50,000 people to take a trip to the moon. We could do that. Since we know it's roughly about, you could do the math here, assume we're 10 times better than the Apollo program. So instead of $30 billion a person, which is what it was then, it's $3 billion a person. So why don't we put 1,000 people on the moon? Well, it's going to be roughly that amount of money. Maybe Elon Musk will get it down to $100 million a person. You can do the math here. These are very big numbers. But we could start building those rockets. We could have subsidies on building rockets. We could give grants. We could require the rockets to be built, just like we're going to require that you only buy an electric car. We'll ban the use of airplanes and make you take a rocket ship. Governments could pass laws like that. They do it all the time. And on the way to trying, things will happen, right? Money will get spent, bad stuff will happen. On the way to trying to decarbonize, which is a really catchy phrase, and again, truly silly, because you can't decarbonize civilization, because all of civilization depends on hydrocarbons. Just keep saying that all of it does. You're not going to be decarbonizing it. But you can try, you can start. The path of starting means you'll be buying, because 75% of all the money in the Inflation Reduction Act for green energy is wind, solar, and batteries. So this is a wind, solar, battery story. This is not magic future stuff. This is not about hydrogen, even though they throw that out there. It's not about nukes. It's not about corn alcohol. A horrible waste of alcohol, in my opinion. I mean, there's a very high purpose for alcohol. One of them is not replacing oil. I'm a deep believer in the high purposes of alcohol. Not that deep believer. I mean, I practice in the evenings only. That's just saying. Not before my speech. Kirby wouldn't give me any vodka. High purpose. So if you start, though, you have to build windmills, solar plants, and you build it from stuff. And where's the stuff being made? Where are the parts? Where's the lithium refined? Where's the copper refined? Where's the cobalt refined? Where's the magnesium? Where's the neodymium magnets made? You have 800 pounds of neodymium in each wind turbine. So it's almost a half a ton of a rare earth element called neodymium in each wind turbine, each one. It's a lot of, I just say that's a lot of neodymium. We start building thousands and thousands of wind turbines. 98% of the neodymium is mined and refined in China. This is IEA data. You've probably seen it before. I hope Robert showed you this. So this is refined energy minerals at the top. So the United States is a big source of refined oil, gasoline, and diesel fuels. So is the Middle East. So is China. U.S., Qatar, and Australia are big sources of refined natural gas. By that I mean LNG. It's the structural equivalent of refining it, because you have to do a conversion process to make it useful for export, which is somewhat equivalent in economic terms to the conversion process of making oil into gasoline or diesel. And now if you look at all the energy minerals, and there's more than these, but this is the group that IEA tracks. The rare earths of lithium, cobalt, aluminum. Aluminum is really important, by the way, to the energy transition visionaries, because electric cars, you all know, has a big battery. The battery weighs 1,000 pounds to replace an 80-pound fuel tank. So that the car doesn't weigh 1,000 pounds more and tear up its tires, they use lots of aluminum. And so there's a lot more aluminum in electric cars. So aluminum is a vital part of the electric transition concept. So this is the red bars of the China share of market, global market. They range, as you can see, from roughly 40% to 80%. For specific rare earths, it's 90%, some it's 100%. Down below are battery components. These are electric battery components for lithium batteries, separators, electrolytes, the stuff, polymers, and specific things you need to actually make the battery itself. Their market share is 75 to 80% globally. So the market concentration, what IEA calls energy minerals, well, that is the minerals you need to make green machines and the parts you need to make green machines. The geopolitical market concentration, China, is 3 times higher than the geopolitical concentration OPEC has in oil. If you're a geopolitical analyst, you would just be asking one question: what could possibly go wrong? A lot. So far, China has not exercised any market power. What they've done is the inverse. They are currently overproducing lithium battery parts, lithium batteries, electric vehicles, steel, aluminum. They're overproducing. Why would they overproduce? I mean, are they just dopes? No. Overproduction keeps the price down. What it's keeping the price down does the opposite. It does 2 things. It either kills the industries in the other countries where you're trying to keep it out, or you rope-a-dope a government somewhere in Europe, and now us, to say, oh, we'll have to subsidize those industries so they'll come here, which means that you now start consuming capital, taxpayers' money, to compete with somebody who's already 10 to 20 years ahead of you by virtue of their 20 to 30 years of subsidies, which is economically damaging to the counterparty when you know for a fact that even with subsidies, the new mines you need, this is not my data, International Energy Agency data again, 10 to 16 years to open a net new mine. A new refinery, assuming you have a compliant regulatory environment, you could open a refinery in 5 years, a greenfield refinery, but 5 years. In the United States, it's 5 to 10 years. The manufacturing plants to make the components, they're buildable. We can build them here too. We know this is not. There's no new physics or chemistry. There's no new inventions on this in China. They've just chosen to do it. And now we can reverse that. The question you would have is, should we? I mean, do we need to? And if we did, and some of it we do need to, especially in mining, how do you go about that? Do you go about that by becoming China, or exercise the zeitgeist of the chaotic free markets of America that's created the country we have over the last 200 years? Most politicians on both sides of the aisle right now are essentially chasing the China model. So it's a little disappointing to me, and I think a little dangerous. But we're going to do it because it's cheaper. It's cheaper. Wind is cheap. Sun is free. The wind is free. It's there all the time. It's just free. So it'll make everything, it's better. It's tech, solar tech, clean tech, climate tech. You know why they're using this word. It's to invoke computer tech and telecommunications. It's a magical thinking that they're just like that. It's just like the other tech. It gets cheap fast. It's cheaper. Look at your phone. Compared to the phones you could have bought 10 years ago. It's that emotional zeitgeist that's being pushed. So is it cheaper? Well, we have easy. There's 3 data sets we can look at to answer the question. We'll look at Europe. Europe's built a lot more wind and solar per capita. Forget about in terms of dollars, just the solar and wind combined penetration. That's the x-axis on the far right. As there's more and more solar and wind per person going to the right, the cost of electricity, the y-axis, this is Eurostat data for European countries. There's a 1-to-1 correlation. The more wind and solar on grids, the higher the cost of residential electricity. Or we could go to Excel service territory in the United States, which serves 4 million people. You've heard of this company. They had about 5% of their grid wind and solar just 10 years ago, and they now have 35%. And the average electric bill for an Excel customer, annual bill, went up from $800 a year to $1,900 a year. It tripled. But how can, again, do the thought experiment. Wind is inherently cheap. It's free. Sun is cheap, free. If you install that much stuff in the grid, what happened? Why did the cost of electricity go up? Or let's do the nation at large. This is EIA data, the real cost of electricity And you can see over the last 10 years has been sort of flat. The nominal cost has been trending up very rapidly recently, and the real cost is about to trend up. We've been adding wind and solar to the grid now for about 10 years. Over the last 10 years, if you probably know this, we all noticed there's a shale revolution. What happened to the cost of the fuels that supply 75% of the electricity in America? 75% electricity, gas and coal. If you have any gas drillers here, you know what the cost. Gas has collapsed and it dragged coal down. So 75% of America's electricity comes from burning gas and coal. The cost of those fuels, which dominate the cost of electricity, 70% of the cost of electricity from burning gas and coal is in the cost of the fuel. Or put differently, it means half of the delivered electricity of the country is dependent on the cost of gas and coal. Prices which collapsed, but the price of electricity is kind of trending up. It should have collapsed. Why didn't it collapse? Something else went on. The answer is we added wind and solar. So we've hidden the cost of wind and solar so far in the United States in aggregate. Excel couldn't hide it. The country will follow the Excel path. Germany's did the experiment for us at the national level. This is a graph of the German electric grid's supply by fuel type for the last 20 years. And you can see that they've doubled the size of their electric grid. This is the German electric grid. Germany has spent trillions of dollars building wind and solar. And so you can see that on the right, that's wind and solar. They basically shut down their nukes, left everything else running. So the old grid shrunk a little bit, but not much. And they doubled the grid. Over that 20 years, German consumption of electricity went up 6%. So to supply a 6% increase in electricity, the Germans double the size of their electric grid. This is all you need to know why the cost of electricity tripled in Germany over that time period. And there is a consequence in their process of deindustrializing, because adding market prices for natural gas, which is not discounted Russian Gazprom gas, on the backs upon which they built this stuff, the combination of market clearing prices globally for LNG and tripling the cost of electricity is causing German deindustrialization. And after this grand experiment, on some days, if it's windy and sunny in the summer, they have supplied as much as 70% of their electricity from wind and solar on a given day. Good for them. Totally irrelevant. Cost of electricity is 300% higher because they keep the lights on 24/7. Like a German winter is like where I come from in Canada. I mean, solar power in Germany, these people are nuts. At that latitude, the sun doesn't rise until 9:30 or 10 o'clock, and it sets at 3. And it's cloudy a lot. So the actual capacity factor of that huge solar is 6% in Germany. 6%. A capacity factor of a gas turbine in Germany, you could probably guess, is 75%. So $1 spent on a watt of gas turbines gets you 75 cents worth of power, in a sense. $1 spent on a solar watt gets you 6 cents. Again, that's why they got expensive power. But we're going to try. We're going to follow Germany. So let me tell you why we won't be able to follow Germany, because Germany and all of Europe, plus the United States, Canada has joined the insane club, Japan might, are all going to build lots more batteries, lots more windmills. Okay. Here's what's going to happen. We're going to inflate the cost of the materials needed to build it. And not maybe, I guarantee it, if we keep doing it. We may, I think we'll stop. Here's how I know. We have to go now from BTUs to pounds. Different measure. Quit counting BTUs and kilowatt hours. Pounds of stuff. So civilization, all civilization needs energy, but to get energy we have to, and food, we extract stuff from the earth and move it around. I mean, this is the way it is. So there's only 4 classes of things that we extract and move around to build and do everything. Biomass stuff, which is food and fuel for animals, but for humans. So biomass, construction materials, that's mostly concrete, rocks, that kind of stuff. Oil, gas, and coal, and metals. That's it. That's all of civilization. It gets built from that. And we've gone over the last 50 years from 25 gigatons of stuff extracted from the earth and moved around to 100 gigatons, 100 billion tons of stuff extracted from the earth. And we've done a pretty good job of it, because the cost, broadly speaking, over that time period, the cost to live has gone down. Economies have grown more than that. This is a 4x increase globally in tonnage. But if you mapped out global GDP, it's gone up 8x. So the footprint of stuff we extract per dollar of wealth is going down, but the wealth is growing faster, which I will stipulate as a forecaster, most people hope will continue. You don't get to cut down our footprint any other way than to cut wealth. This one graph proves that. I didn't put the wealth curve on because it just goes off the chart. Okay, so here's what you want to know about energy, because go back. The energy of the world, oil, gas, and coal, you can see in tons, right? It's about 20 billion tons of stuff we move around, oil, gas, and coal. Now, most of that stuff of tonnage is oil and gas. And it's really easy to move oil and gas around because you move so much of it in pipes. It's a pound of natural gas is worth a lot more than a pound of coal if you do it in pound terms. And it's very easy to move. Now, you go to windmills, solar arrays, offshore, onshore, and you count the tons of stuff that you need to build the machines per watt. This is how much concrete, how much steel, how much stuff do I need? This is common materials, glass. Natural gas is on your right, solar and wind and hydro on your left. This just bottom line, 10 times more tonnage of concrete, steel, and glass collectively have to be moved per unit of energy delivered to society of common materials. Is that a problem? No, there's lots of rock in the world. I mean, glass is easy. It's made from sand. It's just stuff. It has a cost consequence and also has an environmental consequence, but it's not a roadblock. We can 10x gravel. We can 10x concrete. We can 10x steel. Steel is made from iron, the most common element after silica. But here's the problem. All the windmills, solar arrays, electric cars, they also use all these other energy minerals at a higher rate than conventional energy. Conventional energy is simplistically steel, a little bit of nickel, to make chrome and stuff. But it's mostly just steel and iron, some copper, oil, gas, or coal. That's it. If a car is 85 by weight, a car is 85% steel and iron, and the rest is rubber and glass. An electric car is 80% by weight, all this other stuff, nickel, cadmium, copper, lithium, aluminum, all the exotic stuff. That stuff is harder to get out of the ground because it exists at low concentrations. By that I mean ore grades, if you're ever involved in geology, for iron, 50 to 80%. I mean, some iron ore in the dirt is almost pure iron. You can see it's like rusty sand. Copper in copper ore occurs at 0.5%. So if you need a ton of iron to make steel, you have to dig up a ton and a quarter of earth. If you need a ton of copper, you can probably do the arithmetic here, right? At 0.5%. That's not 10 times. We're digging up, to get a pound of copper, you're digging up tons. It's crazy. So what you find if you map that out is that to deliver the same unit of energy to society as power plant, not energy in kilowatt hours, you need 10 times more minerals than conventional energy. You need 5 times more minerals per car compared to a conventional car. But the 10 times more minerals per watt is an understatement. Remember, let's give the Germans 10% capacity factor. If you want to deliver the same energy with a watt of solar, you have to build 10 watts of solar because you have to store the energy and do it when the sun is around. So this number is actually an understatement, but we'll stick with the watts. You need 10 times, roughly, more minerals. Some minerals you only need 4 times more, 400%. Some you need 8,000% more. Depends on the mineral. Neodymium is going to have to go up 7,000%. These are big numbers. These are big increases. So the mining industry that mines those metals today digs out of the ground ore and rock equal to a volume of 7,000 pyramids. That's a picture of the pyramids at Giza. So every year right now, we dig up and process and crush 7,000 pyramids worth of rock to get the metals we need. The energy transition will require digging up 50,000 pyramids worth of rock a year. That's a lot of D9s, a lot of trucks, a lot of cats, a lot of diesels, a lot of Komatsus. That's a lot of diesel fuel. I'm just telling you, it's a lot. It's going to be a lot. So you'll know the transition's happening, by the way. If you're an investor, there's only one stock you have to watch. You can know what I'm going to tell you it's going to be. Caterpillar. If Caterpillar's order book reflects what this suggests, because you have to order those machines years in advance. You don't order a Komatsu, with the colors you want and get it, go down to the dealer and pick it up. the lead time is years. So if the miners believed this was going to happen, the order books would be filling up at Caterpillar. They're a public company. They would report an order book with a 10x jump in heavy equipment. They haven't. I mean, their demand is up. It's not 10x, not even close. So what's going to happen in the energy transition is the use of these metals and minerals, which have lots of purposes. Copper's used for lots of things. So is lithium. So is cobalt. So is nickel. Most of those metals, their uses in the energy domain are a small share of all uses for all purposes in the world. 10%, 20%, that kind of thing. That flips. In the energy transition world, the primary use for those metals will be to build energy machines, windmills, batteries, and solar turbines. This will have an astonishing impact on the prices of those metals. It will have an astonishing impact on the cost of getting to those metals because the demand exceeds supply by order of magnitude. We'll pick one to give you an example. They all look like this. So I'll just do copper. We could do everything. Every single metal has a graph that looks like this. So I just do copper because copper is the anchor metal for electrification. Copper is largely non-substitutable. That means if you have copper in an electric motor, if you don't have copper, you don't have an electric motor. Aluminum electric motors are terrible. There's substitutability at very high voltages for transmission, essentially no substitutability. Use copper in computer chips, by the way. AI chips use copper. They don't use non-copper because copper is a great conductor. It's a magic element. The world supply-demand copper sort of is in balance, plus or minus, something on the order of 1 million tons. Some is 500,000 tons because it's a commodity market. The graph on the right, the red line is the forecast from all of the EV enthusiasts at the rate of increase of the sale of new EVs. They're projecting by 2030, half of all cars being bought in the world will be EVs. So this is just, we know how much copper is in EVs, 400 pounds more copper than in a regular car. So you don't have to be a genius. Just multiply the number of cars by the 400 pounds, tells you tons of copper you need, and then go look at the world's copper production and ask the question, are we making that much copper? That's what S&P did. And they show the world going into collapsing into copper deficit by amounts greater than ever in the history of copper. So you say, we'll build more copper mines. That's 8 years from now. Not even 8 years, 6 years from now. It takes 10 to 16 years to build a new copper mine. Copper mine production is on a slight decline, not increase right now, because of all kinds of geopolitical factors. So what do you think will happen? This is a very easy thought experiment. If you needed copper, you're a business. I'll pick two kinds of businesses. Let's say you make electric cars. You have to have copper for the battery, for the bus bar, because your transmission line is your drive shaft. You need copper in the motors. So you need copper. People who build buildings like this one or skyscrapers also need copper. You can't replace the copper in it. They both need copper. The building, let's say the building costs $10 million and copper prices go up, but they can't build the building without the copper. Even though the copper is only $10,000 of a $10 million building, they'll bid it up to $50,000. They'll bid it up to $100,000 to build a $10 million building. So that the CEO of a mining company was on Bloomberg 2 weeks ago and said, if this happens, the price of copper will go up 10x, the bid war. That just is so because there'll be a bid war. The people who really need it will bid it up. 10x on copper, just for copper, nothing else, increases the cost of an EV like a Tesla by $15,000. So it's $15,000 more per Tesla just for the copper. And they won't get the copper, though. They could bid it up and to $20,000 and take it from the construction industry. The construction guys will bid it to $30,000. They don't care. They're price insensitive. That's what will happen. Now, this is all going to be done. We're moving down that path. We have started down that path. This is not, we shouldn't do this. We are doing this. We are funding battery factories without funding the input to the battery factories. We're pretending we're funding the input to the battery factories, but what in fact we're doing is moving Inflation Reduction Act money to Saudi Arabia, and this is not an exaggeration, it's published. Biden administration went to the Saudis. The Saudis said they would build copper refineries so that they could use their resources to invest in African copper mines, which we can't invest in because we demand things like no children mining. That first picture I showed you. We ask things like that of the miners. The Saudis, not so much. But Inflation Reduction Act money will move through Saudi Arabia into Africa to get necessary minerals because they're a free trade partner, and the act was cleverly written to allow the shifting of domestic money to non-domestic sources for domestic purposes, even though it's built in America. So watch for more like that. That's what will happen because they have no choice. There is no choice. Meantime, this is all being done to cut carbon dioxide emissions. So I haven't used the C word once. No climate came out of my mouth, but we all know why we're doing this. It's to cut carbon dioxide emissions. So the EV is the pinata for this. The electric vehicle is the single avatar for the whole energy transition that everybody cares about, they're worried about. No tailpipe, no CO2. Duh. And everybody then says, well, you have to plug it in, so if you happen to be part of the United States with a coal grid or hydrocarbon or gas, you get some emissions from that. Everybody knows that in the intelligentsia. So they say, yeah, well, but the grids are cleaner, we're going to keep making them cleaner. So what you would do if you're a smart analyst, and Volkswagen did this, said, well, what are the emissions over the life of a car from when it's built? You cause emissions to happen when you build the vehicle, make the steel, make the glass, and then make the battery, to make the copper, it causes emissions. Then when you drive it, you cause emissions by driving it if it's an internal combustion engine, and you cause emissions on grids by charging the vehicle up based on the kind of grid you're on. So this is a small Volkswagen, diesel versus EV, and what you can see is both of them left of the zero during the production phase have some emissions. So it's about 5 tons of emissions to make conventional vehicle, and in this model, about 12 tons of CO2 emitted to build the EV. Most of that's the battery. And then you can see they show the EV's emissions aren't zero, they actually show it rising more slowly than the combustion, because that's the grid in Europe. And then they show the diesel one. Finally, after 60,000 miles, if you bought that EV, you'll have emitted less CO2 than the EV. I mean, the EV will have beat the diesel. But for the first 60,000 miles of driving, you've actually contributed more CO2 to the atmosphere buying the diesel. So now what you have to do is figure out, well, is that the right number for building the battery? Well, we know the answer is no. It's highly variable because the mines vary, the ore grades vary, where the stuff comes from. The number is very fixed for steel, but it's not fixed for the other stuff. And do the grids look like that? Well, they vary too. And do internal combustion engines always emit that much? Well, you could buy a more efficient car. So maybe what you would do is you would model the variables inside of a range of things that we know. I did this. So what you can find is that an EV's emissions, just to build it, could be 45 tons of CO2. This is not me guessing. This is technical literature based on mines that exist and what we're. But you could buy a more efficient internal combustion engine. That's possible. And so the orange line goes down more over the lifetime. But you start from a point to build the EV that actually emits more CO2 than the internal combustion engine emitted over the entire life of driving the vehicle. This is not a hypothetical scenario. That's a scenario that's based on data that exist for the kinds of mines and refineries that exist to make the materials to make the battery. You say, well, we'll make it better. I mean, technology gets better. If we make the battery lighter, smaller, with more energy, higher energy density, it'll get better. Yes, it will. It will. Yes, of course it will. But this is where the physics come in, and the comic book silly stuff comes in. You know, people saying that this is kind of like when I say, no, they never get as good as oil. Oh, no, you know, smartphone substitution, you forecasters, you missed that. Look what happened to landlines. They went away. You missed that. This is going to be just like cell phones replacing landlines. This is going to be like computers, handhelds replacing desktops. Okay, here's the problem. You're starting with the physics of the materials, the energetics of the lithiated chemical. That's the green line in watt hours per kilogram. So that's down the green line, getting better with the dotted line. The little bubble up there is where oil resides. That's the energetics of oil. That's the fundamental energy density. 50 times more energy per pound than lithiated chemicals. There's nothing you can do to close that gap. What you can do is change chemistries, and there are chemistries that are twice as good, which would be really great. They're 5 times more expensive, and I don't know how to build them yet. We'll do it, but they're still not even close to oil. The idea that you can make lithium batteries have the energy density of oil is literally the same as the power pack in Tony Stark's Iron Man chest. It's a really cute idea for a comic book. You can't do it in the physics that we know about. Maybe in the future. But here's what else we know in the physics of electricity. If we put batteries on the road, assume the cars get cheap, or we subsidize them all, we require you only buy EVs, and that they are just as easy to charge, and they don't degrade in cold weather. The chemistry, all that happens. We have to build fueling stations. And for the people involved in the electric utility industry, they know something about fueling stations because they can look at gasoline fueling stations. There's lots of them on the highway. You see them all the time. A typical fueling station for a gasoline vehicle has the electric demand of a 7-Eleven. You know, it's a convenience store with pumps that use a few watts. And you can fill a tank in 5 minutes. A fast charge is 30 to 40 minutes, but you could imagine a theoretical battery that's 5 minutes, fine. But to do fast, you have to have high power. You have to go to megawatts. In fact, a typical fueling station on the highway in Colorado would have the electric demand between that of a stadium and a steel mill. So that means in electric distribution terms, not the energy, you're going to have to build thousands, because just in Colorado, country has 180,000 of them, thousands of steel mill class electric demand transformers. Can't get them anywhere in the world. They don't exist. We don't build them at that rate. Someday maybe, we're not building them at that rate, not even close, not by a factor of 100 are we building them that fast. Lastly, I'll leave you with this 2 other sort of closing thoughts on the impossibility, that the impossible dream, kind of. I titled a report called The Impossible Dream because it is impossible. And I'm not besmirching people's motives for aspiring to this, just saying it's impossible. The thing about wind and solar is they're episodic. You all know that. I mean, the sun goes down, wind lulls. That variability is irrelevant. It's just you can make batteries for that. You know, hour, half hour, a few hours. That's not the problem. The problem is 2 things. One is seasonal variability, and the other are droughts. Seasonal variability is easily stated. It's brighter in the summer than the winter, or vice versa. Depends on where you live on the planet. It's brighter what is the variable insolence of power at square meter from peak to non-peak in California? 2 to 1. It varies 2 to 1. So if you need a watt worth of power in one time of the season, you'd have to build 2 square meters instead of 1 square meter to get the same delivered energy, because the incident energy is down by a half. The wind variability, these are actual graphs of seasonal wind and seasonal solar variability. 2 to 1, roughly. So to make it your primary source of energy, you have to, right off the bat, double the amount of capacity you're going to build as a minimum. And then you have this problem called wind droughts. So Mesa had a drought, North Sea had drought. Wind droughts are absolutely guaranteed to occur. In the meteorological history of the United States, there have been roughly a dozen continent-wide droughts. That is, the entire continent of the United States has been becalmed and cloud-covered 12 times in 30 years. You build grids for 30 years. So, all right, what happens if one of those happens? We cannot predict them. The independent or coincident occurrence of these things is guaranteed to happen. They're impossible to predict when they happen. So MISO had a wind drought for 10 days, and they didn't go black. This was 2 years ago, because they have a lot of coal still on that grid. A 10-day drought for them would have cost them hundreds of billions of dollars in batteries. If you thought about the United States and you wanted to prepare for a 1-day drought for an all-wind solar grid, you have to build $4 trillion of batteries. That's at the forecast price for which DOE says the batteries will go down to, not today's prices. Battery prices are going to go up, not down. How do I know? 70% of the cost of a battery is in the bill of materials now. We've gotten very good at building them. We build gigawatt hours of batteries. The bill of materials is nickel, cobalt, lithium, manganese. I don't care what the soup is. And all the minerals prices are going to go up if we can demand the quantities that we're going to demand. So the price of batteries in the future has nothing to do with manufacturing. It has only to do with the miners. So the intelligentsia in the energy transition community know everything I told you. They really do, the smart ones. They really know this. And they know that the transition is not possible to, quote, decarbonize by building windmills and solar arrays. So they are proposing, and this is from the IEA, which has been very honest about it, is that this will require, in addition to all this money being spent on EVs, we must have behavioral changes. And they're very specific about what they mean by behavioral changes. For charging electric cars, in order to avoid stressing transformers, the charger won't operate if the transformer is stressed. It will communicate to the charger and say, I'm sorry, you don't get charged. And of course, what that would mean, by the way, is in a local distribution loop, since a home charger, an overnight charger in each garage will double the load on that distribution loop, that will mean that you'll be taking turns charging your car, whoever gets there first, or you could auction, but basically you can't fuel a car when you want. That's a behavioral change. You could do that. I think people will like it. They're very specific that in flying, the world needs to cap business flights. They have to reduce the number of flights, never mind if the world is growing. From 5 years ago, the level of business flights have to decrease by something like 30%. They already have done that in Spain and in France. It's illegal to take a flight if there's a 2-hour or shorter train ride available. You have to cap leisure flights. You'll be allowed 1 flight on a plane to Bahamas a year, but not 2. You're going to shift to rail. In the home, you have to, and this is being explicit, we have to require that all thermostats can be remotely controlled so that you'll be warmer in the summer and cooler in the winter, because heat pumps are not going to solve the problem, neither will solar. You're going to require less cooling in the summer, and it's kind of, I really was amused that they actually added this. They didn't call it clotheslines. They want to ban the proliferation of clothes dryers. They want you to air dry your clothes. That's called a clothesline. My mother had a clothesline. She grew up in the Great Depression. She had a clothesline. She really liked her dryer anyway. And of course, driving behaviors, you have to ban internal combustion engines. You're going to require ride sharing and require slower driving. They call it eco-driving. Speed limits come down. So here's where I'll end with. The most impressive accomplishment of civilization, almost without exception, if you want to pick just one thing, is the collapse in the cost of energy to keep humans alive and do things and have fun and entertain. For most of human history, 70 to 80% of all of an economy, all of the GDP of every country in the world, was occupied by getting food and fuel. Food is fuel for people and animals for labor, food and fuel. And it collapsed with the dawn of the hydrocarbon age. Everything I've told you would tell you what we're doing is reversing history. We're increasing the physical footprint and increasing the cost of food and fuel. This is an extraordinarily immoral experiment, in my view, but I think it will not end well. If you were in the oil and gas business, I'm not beat up on wind and solar, they're fine. I like electric cars, there'll be millions more of them. There's zero threat to the future of oil and gas. The only threat to the future of oil and gas are politicians who think you shouldn't consume it. And politicians have a track record of banning things. They can do that. It's been done in many countries. It's been done over history. It's been done in our country. I'll end with my really lame joke about alcohol. Because alcohol is a fuel, I think we should ban that. But the government, our government, with our state government's complicity, passed a constitutional amendment in 1920 to make it illegal to produce and consume alcohol. It's crazy. You know how long that law was on the books before it was finally voted away by 13 years? I think because we do a lot more with energy than we did with alcohol, I suspect we'll get faster to restoration of sanity, but there's no guarantee. So I'm very optimistic we'll have a great future because of what technology has taken. I'm cautiously optimistic we'll have a recalibration to political normalcy. We'll see what could happen. Thank you. I think we probably have a few minutes for questions before I have to. Is that right, Kirby? All right. Any objections? If you have objections, just in advance, you're wrong, so you know. I'm kidding.
Raise your hand. Let's go into the questions.
Any questions, objections, observations?
Questions?
Tangents?
Right here.
Said something that offended you? Sure.
Caleb Waller. I'm actually running for HT 57. So your last kind of jab at politicians, I kind of need something optimistic to run with here. I mean, I love oil and gas. I love local economies, all that good stuff. So I don't know, give me something positive here. What can I do as a future legislator to make things better in Colorado?
Well, I think just reminding people that the core conceit of all the motivation to avoid oil and gas, to punish it, the climate narrative, the core conceit is that there's a future harm that we're theoretically making. And everyone knows what you tell them. It's computer models. There's a future potential harm, which to be honest, we don't know what it might be or could be nothing, could be a lot, but it's future. And we're spending a lot of money that could cause real harms today in today's economy. So people have to be honest. And as a political matter, what we have to do is make it clear that this policy will be making that kind of choice. And if you want to spend that amount of money more today, personally, that much more for your heating bill, whatever, for a theoretical calculation on a future potential harm based on computer models, people are allowed to make that decision, but we're not making it starkly clear. I think any politician who made that starkly clear, rather than saying silly things like climate change is an apocalypse, most serious people know there's no apocalypse. not enough serious people know that extreme weather today has nothing whatsoever to do with climate change. There's always been extreme weather. The UN body, the most useful thing you could do as a politician is find the page, get a staffer to find the page from the last IPCC report, take a picture of it, highlight it for a slide and hold up, in which it states current weather extremes are not correlated with the models for future. I mean, they state it in their document that everybody wants to cite. So just hold that up. So that drought had nothing to do with climate change. Future drought might, but not this one. So says the UN's climate scientists. No one really is saying that. The people that say it are being labeled as kooks. And I think a lot of politicians are afraid to be labeled as a climate denier and a kook. So we just have to have more candor using that kind of ammunition. It's not complicated ammunition. You know, a junior staffer in a front office can find that document. It's easy to find.
Next question.
Hello, I'm Carmia Woolley with the VLM. Just a question for you. I assume, but I don't know if it's correct, that a lot of your graphs were looking at resource extraction for sources of materials, but I'm curious if you've considered waste management, you know, the end of life of, you know, and the reuse and recycling of materials.
Yeah. This field is so big, it's hard to do. If I did all the graphs, we'd be here all day. So obviously, end of life cycle matters for all machinery. And so if there's an asymmetry right now, the wind and solar and battery industry are not costing or planning for end of life waste disposal. They're not. All the oil and gas industry has to. The nuclear industry has it baked into law. So most industrial facilities have, in that class, the energy business, have end-of-life management. The wind, solar, and batteries do not. So they're talking in theory about recycling, what could be used. Wind turbine blades cannot be recycled yet, maybe in theory one day. And they, instead of lasting 20 years, they typically last 10, some less. So they're non-recyclable plastics entirely. And so for those who are plastic phobes, a small wind farm, there's lots of 100-megawatt wind farms in Colorado. A 100-megawatt wind farm in it has more non-recyclable plastic than all the world's plastic straws and cups combined. And so when that blade fails, it's just going to be cut up, stuck in landfill. Same with solar panels. So you should count that and should cost it. So people are not being honest about it. So I didn't count that because I'd have to put theoretical numbers in. One could. But total life cycles do require all those considerations, including water use, water management, water pollution. But again, the favored transition technologies are all worse for all those things because the sheer volume of things you have to extract and build and use is so high. So all the water pollution, all the air pollution issues associated with oil and gas are made a factor 10 more difficult for wind and solar, upstream, where you get all the metals and minerals, and in places where you can't control it, like Africa.
Additional questions?
There's one right here.
Is there any research or data on, I'll just say rare earth minerals in general, and the availability of what exists on this planet?
That's a good question. You might think, for those who remember Malthusian and Malthus, and you might, and the limits to growth, that I don't think there's enough minerals in the planet. We have functionally infinite supply of all the metals and minerals we need, all the oil and gas and coal we need. There's a lot of research on where they exist and what concentrations. The U.S. was the biggest miner and refiner of rare earth minerals until the year 2000. We now produce nearly zero. We have lots of rare earth mineral deposits, including in Colorado, by the way. There's lots of economically viable mineral deposits everywhere on the planet. It's just mining is a very difficult business. So setting aside the permitting, even if the permitting were just a rubber stamping, these are big machines, big holes, you know, it's big conveyors. It takes time. You could probably build a mine in 6 to 8 years if you really, you know, put pedal to the metal. So there's a lot of data on this. There's no shortage of the metals. The problem is how fast can you get more copper mines? So the world's increased its consumption of copper 100-fold over the last 3 centuries. And copper prices have been flat and declining. It's crazy. I mean, it's really amazing. That's because we did it over centuries, not over 10 years. 10 years we can't do. We just know we can't do it. So there's no shortage. it's all about the velocity, and this is true for all things. That's why I did the wind turbine example. You can't build 1,000 wind turbines a day and install them. We don't have the industrial capacity to do that. You could make it up in a science fiction novel, but you can't actually do it. Same is true for minerals. The mineral resource base is very, very high. And it's difficult to know exactly because we have theoretical models for sub-ocean, subfloor. So both mineral nodules, you probably read about it on ocean floor, can be harvested just by vacuuming, literally vacuuming nodules up. So there's been a lot of work looking at seabed mining because you could do it in international waters technically without permits. Resource base there is extraordinarily high, huge, but the technology is nascent. A lot of opposition in the UN to doing that still. Lots of minerals, just not enough to build those cars in the next 5 to 10 years.